The rain didn't fall in drops, it crashed down in sizzling, vaporous sheets, hissing against the research station's reinforced dome. Even through 3 layers of shielding, the corrosive downpour of Zephyr 7 could be heard, an eerie, ceaseless whisper of destruction. Anything organic caught in the storm would dissolve within seconds. Even metal, given enough exposure, would weaken and collapse into sludge. Elias Carter tightened his grip on the reinforced railing inside the observation deck, watching the swirling orange haze beyond the protective walls. The planet was a graveyard for anything unprepared. "It's a wonder your species even made it this far," Dr. Vraxen muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. The alien professor stood beside Elias, his 4 elongated fingers clasped behind his back. His deep violet skin shimmered under the dim artificial lighting, his slitted eyes radiating smug amusement. No natural armor. No exoskeleton. No adaptive respiratory systems. Frankly, it's a statistical anomaly that humans have survived at all, let alone explored the stars. Elias didn't take the bait. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his breath misting against the transparent viewport. "I guess we make up for it with ingenuity." Dr. Vraxen snorted, a sound somewhere between a scoff and an actual biological excretion. "Your ingenuity is the only reason your species is still breathing inside that ridiculous synthetic suit." He gestured lazily toward the environmental pressure suits hanging on the decontamination rack. "If your technology fails, so do you." Elias glanced back at the research team behind them, 2 humans, a reptilian Vietari, and an insectoid Kyraxi, all engaged in monitoring equipment and adjusting calculations. The station's environmental readings fluctuated, showing rising acidity levels in the atmosphere. "It will fail," Vraxen continued, watching Elias with thinly veiled amusement. "This world does not allow mistakes. Your oxygen recyclers are degrading at an accelerated rate. The outer coating of your protective suits already shows microscopic fractures after just 1 excursion. And if that filtration system collapses, your lungs will liquefy faster than you can scream for help." Elias turned, crossing his arms. "So what's your solution, Professor? Give up? Pack our bags and leave?" Vraxen exhaled sharply, a sound of exasperation. "The solution is to accept reality. This planet is beyond your species' capacity to endure without continuous external support. You humans are resilient, within limits. But there are worlds that simply do not care how adaptable you think you are. This is one of them." Elias remained silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Then, a slow grin stretched across his face. "That sounds like a challenge." Vraxen blinked, taken aback. "A challenge?" Elias turned away, stepping toward the decontamination chamber. "You just said humans can't survive here without your tech. That means, by your logic, if I can prove otherwise, I win." The alien professor scoffed. "Win what, exactly?" "I'll prove that humans don't just survive. We adapt." Elias's fingers danced over the station's control panel, preparing for an excursion. "Give me 24 hours. I'll build a filtration system out of nothing but local materials." A hush fell over the room. Even the other researchers turned to stare. Vraxen's mandibles twitched slightly, betraying his amusement. "That's absurd. You can't just invent technology from 24 hours. Elias hit the final command, and the station's outer hatch hissed open. The acidic wind howled against the reinforced corridor leading outside. He turned back, flashing a confident grin. "Unless you're afraid a biologically inadequate human is about to embarrass you?" Vraxen narrowed his eyes. "Very well. Let's see if your ingenuity is stronger than the laws of nature." Elias pulled on his reinforced suit and stepped into the airlock. As the outer doors slid shut behind him, the countdown began. 24 hours to build the impossible. Or die trying. The moment Elias stepped beyond the station's shielded corridor, the planet reminded him exactly what he was up against. Acid rain crashed down in relentless torrents, turning the barren landscape into a simmering, mist-choked wasteland. The sky was a swirling mass of orange and green, thick with corrosive vapors that hissed against his reinforced suit. Every surface beyond the protective barrier bore deep etches and scars, evidence of a world that never stopped consuming. Elias exhaled, his breath fogging up the inside of his visor. One mistake out here, and he'd become part of the landscape. "Carter, are you reading us?" came the voice of Dr. Vraxen through the comms, sounding both bored and amused. Loud and clear, Elias muttered, stepping cautiously across the rocky terrain. Each footfall sent up faint wisps of vapor where the ground reacted to the moisture in his suit's boots. "This is pointless, you know," Vraxen continued, his voice carrying the same smug condescension as before. "Your species' insistence on overcoming the impossible is nothing but hubris. You will fail." Elias ignored him, focusing on his surroundings. The research station's environmental scanners had indicated that some of the local minerals exhibited unusual chemical properties, possibly capable of neutralizing acidity. If he had any chance of crafting a filtration system, he needed to find those materials first. He moved toward a jagged outcrop of dark rock, its surface slick and glistening from the rain. Carefully, he reached out and chipped off a fragment with a reinforced geologist's hammer. The moment the piece separated, a thin plume of vapor rose, the exposed surface reacting violently to the open air. He pulled the sample closer to his visor, analyzing its structure. The outer layers had clearly hardened over time, suggesting some form of natural resistance to the corrosive atmosphere. If he could process it correctly, there was a chance it could serve as the foundation for his filter. "You're wasting time, Carter," Vraxen's voice cut in again. "Even if you find something mildly resistant to the acidity, you still lack the technology to refine it. You don't have the resources to synthesize a stable filtration membrane out of raw minerals." Elias smirked. "Good thing I like solving problems." He took more samples, securing them in reinforced containment pouches before turning back toward the station. He had something to work with. Now came the hard part. Back inside, Elias stripped out of his environmental suit, shaking off droplets of residual moisture before sealing the containment chamber. The station's interior smelled like ozone and burned metal, a side effect of constant air filtration struggling to keep up with the planet's atmosphere. He dumped the mineral samples onto the work table and began testing. Using a high-powered spectrometer, he analyzed the chemical composition. As suspected, the rock contained elements capable of neutralizing acidity, but only in trace amounts. He needed to find a way to extract and concentrate those properties. He fired up the lab's microrefinery and ground the mineral into a fine powder, then began experimenting with different chemical treatments. The first attempt failed spectacularly. As soon as the treated sample was exposed to a simulated acidic environment, the material crumbled into dust, completely ineffective as a filter. Elias frowned, adjusting his approach. He tried heating the material, compressing it into denser layers, even combining it with synthetic polymers salvaged from damaged equipment. Nothing worked. Each failure was another confirmation of what Vraxen had predicted. "You see?" The professor's voice returned through the comms, dripping with satisfaction. "Reality does not care about your optimism, Carter. The elements do not yield to sheer willpower." Elias exhaled sharply, leaning back from the lab bench. His mind raced, searching for a different approach. He refused to accept failure. That was when the power flickered. The entire station shuddered, alarms flaring as system warnings flooded the monitors. Oxygen levels decreasing. Filtration failure imminent. Elias stiffened. That wasn't supposed to happen. The filtration system wasn't perfect, but it still had days, not hours, before critical failure. A new voice came through the comms, one of the human researchers, Dr. Naomi Patel. "Elias, the filtration unit is degrading faster than expected. We're losing containment." His heart pounded. If the station's oxygen system collapsed, they'd all be dead long before he finished his experiment. Vraxen's voice returned, far calmer than it should have been. "I did warn you. This planet does not allow failure. And now, you are out of time." Elias gritted his teeth. No. Failure wasn't an option. He turned back to his workbench and grabbed a fresh sample of the mineral. There had to be something he was missing. He had less than 6 hours before the station's filtration system completely collapsed. It was no longer just about proving a point. Now, it was about survival. The emergency alarms wouldn't stop screaming. Elias barely heard the voices over the blaring warnings flashing across the station's monitors. Oxygen levels decreasing. Filtration failure imminent. The station's air supply, already strained by the acidic atmosphere outside, was collapsing far sooner than anyone had predicted. Too soon. We're down to 5 hours of breathable air. Dr. Naomi Patel's voice crackled through the comms, frantic. Something's corroding the primary filtration membrane faster than expected. Elias's mind raced. This wasn't just about proving a point to Vraxen anymore. If he didn't solve this now, they'd all be dead before morning. Dr. Vraxen's voice came through, maddeningly calm. I did warn you. Humans lack the necessary adaptations for a world like this. The station was never designed for long-term habitation, and your species' technology was always going to fail first. Elias ignored him, focusing on the work in front of him. The filter. It was their only hope. The problem was, his first attempts had already failed, spectacularly. He stared at the crushed remnants of his latest test, the mineral sample reduced to a pile of brittle dust. What am I missing? Elias turned toward Naomi, who was manually overriding the failing system to buy them time. Tell me exactly what's happening to the filters. She barely spared him a glance, her fingers flying over the console. Same problem as before, acidic particles in the atmosphere are breaking down the station's filtration membrane at an accelerated rate. It's like something in the air is actively dissolving our synthetic compounds faster than predicted. Elias frowned. That didn't make sense. The filtration membranes were reinforced with corrosion-resistant materials designed for extreme environments. Why was the breakdown happening so quickly? Then, a thought struck him. What if it's not just the acidity? He turned toward the alien professor. Vraxen, does SciFi 7 have biological components in the air? Microorganisms? Vraxen's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course. Most extreme worlds have microbial life, though nothing that could be considered intelligent. What does that have to do with your failing system? Elias grabbed a sample vial from the storage shelf. If there are microbes in the air, they might be feeding on the filtration membrane, accelerating the breakdown. Our materials weren't designed to account for a biological contaminant. Naomi's eyes widened. If that's true, then we've been trying to fix the wrong problem. Vraxen scoffed. And how, exactly, do you plan to solve this revelation? You have neither the time nor the equipment to synthesize a bioresistant alternative. Elias smirked, already moving toward the workbench. Maybe not, but this planet does. Elias retrieved a fresh mineral sample, carefully grinding it into a fine powder. If his hunch was correct, the minerals he had collected earlier weren't just resistant to the acidity, they might also contain a natural defense mechanism against SciFi 7's microbial life. He pulled up the spectrometer readings again, cross-referencing the elements in the rock with known biological inhibitors. His pulse quickened as a pattern emerged. It wasn't much, but it was there, something naturally produced by the planet's geology to protect itself from the acidic environment. If he could extract and amplify it, he might be able to coat their filtration system with a biological shield, stopping the microbial degradation. Vraxen peered over his shoulder. Your plan is based entirely on assumption. If you are wrong, the station will fail, and you will all suffocate. Elias didn't even look up. Yeah? Well, if I sit around doing nothing, we're dead anyway. He worked fast, dissolving the powdered mineral in a solvent and isolating the enzyme-rich compounds. The process was crude, messy, inefficient, and untested, but it was the best they had. Within minutes, he had coated a small sample of the station's failing filtration membrane with the extracted compound. This either works, or we start running out of air real fast. Naomi ran a simulation, exposing the treated sample to the planet's atmospheric conditions. They all watched in tense silence as the corrosive elements lashed against the membrane. The untreated sections dissolved in seconds. But the coated section held firm. Vraxen's eyes flickered with something Elias had never seen before: surprise. Naomi's voice was barely a whisper. It's working. The enzyme coating was acting as a biological shield, preventing the microbes from consuming the material. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. All right. Let's get this applied to the whole system before we all stop breathing. One last problem. As Naomi prepared to implement the fix, a deep rumble shook the station. Elias braced himself against the workbench as the walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. What the hell was that? He demanded. Vraxen's expression darkened. A seismic event. A second tremor hit, this time stronger. The station's emergency lights flickered. Naomi's face paled. That wasn't a normal quake. Elias turned toward the viewport, staring into the swirling, acidic storm outside. In the distance, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: a deep fissure forming in the ground, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. His stomach twisted. This planet wasn't just corrosive. It was alive. And something beneath the surface had just woken up. The ground lurched violently, nearly knocking Elias off his feet. The station's reinforced walls groaned under the strain of the seismic tremors, sending a cascade of dust from the ceiling panels. Monitors flashed red, warning of structural instability. Seismic activity increasing. Naomi shouted, gripping the control panel. Magnitude 6.2 and rising. Elias barely had time to process the numbers before another tremor slammed through the station, this one more violent than the last. He caught himself against a railing, hard hammering. "Carter, get over here!" Vraxen barked. His usual arrogance was absent, replaced by something dangerously close to concern. Elias forced himself toward the observation deck. Beyond the station's reinforced windows, the planet's surface was shifting. Cracks had begun to snake outward, jagged veins of glowing, molten-like energy splitting the rocky ground. The acid rain still poured, sizzling against the terrain, but now, something else was moving. Deep fissures yawned open, and from within them, a thick, black mist began to rise. Elias's breath caught in his throat. What the hell is that? Naomi's fingers danced across the scanner controls. Hold on, I'm getting readings. She froze. That's not just gas. There are biological signatures in there. Vraxen's mandibles tightened. Of course there are. Elias turned sharply. You knew? Vraxen's slitted eyes locked onto him. I suspected. Zephyr 7 was never just a lifeless acid planet. The microbial activity in the air was always too aggressive, too complex. It wasn't just atmospheric residue. His gaze drifted back to the growing fissure. Something was feeding on it. A chill ran down Elias's spine. And now it's waking up. The tremors slowed but didn't stop. The ground remained unstable, shifting beneath the planet's relentless weather. But the real danger wasn't above. It was below. Elias had made up his mind before the others even spoke. He pulled his environmental suit from the locker, securing the last of the reinforced seals. Naomi's head snapped toward him. Oh, no. No, 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 you're not thinking. I have to go down there, Elias said firmly. We need to know what we're dealing with. Vraxen crossed his arms. An interesting strategy. Rushing directly into a potentially hostile, unknown biological entity. Elias finished locking his gloves into place. I didn't hear you come up with anything better. Vraxen's mandibles twitched. Fair point. Naomi exhaled, clearly frustrated. At least take a bioscanner and a secondary air filter. Elias grabbed the offered gear, slinging it over his shoulder. He turned toward the external hatch, where the planet's hostile environment waited for him. I'll be back before oxygen levels drop again. Or at least, he hoped he would. The outside world was even worse than before. Elias's boots crunched against the corroded rock as he navigated the unstable ground. He moved quickly, carefully, until he reached the edge of the fissure. It yawned deep into the planet's crust, its walls slick with an unnatural black substance. The mist rising from within swirled, moving with an almost conscious intent. Elias activated his bioscanner. The reading spiked instantly. Unknown organic material detected. Compound structure, enoenterin. He took a breath. All right, let's see what's down here. Then, gripping his harness tightly, Elias descended into the abyss. The deeper he went, the stranger it became. The rock walls weren't just damp with the black substance. They were pulsing. Like veins. Elias swallowed hard. His suit's external sensors blared warnings, registering intense biological activity all around him. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a fissure. It was a living structure. At the very bottom, the ground leveled out into a cavernous space. Pools of liquid shimmered, their surfaces bubbling with acidic reaction. But it wasn't the liquid that made Elias freeze. It was the massive structure looming at the cavern's center. A colossal, organic formation, webbed with bioluminescent veins, pulsed softly in the dim glow. The surface was etched with patterns, not random ones. Deliberate. Designed. His breath hitched. This isn't just life. This is ancient. He took another step closer, scanning the structure, and his blood ran cold at what the readings told him. This wasn't just biological matter. It was a preserved organism. A dormant one. Then, movement. The black mist coiled suddenly, as if reacting to his presence. And from the structure's depths, something shifted. A deep, guttural sound vibrated through the cavern. Not from the planet. From inside the structure. Something was waking up. Elias's heart pounded. He turned sharply, voice urgent over the comms. Naomi Vraxin, you need to see this. Static crackled back. Then, Naomi's voice, panicked. Elias. Get out of there now. The seismic readings just spiked. Something is moving beneath the surface. Elias backed away. The cavern shook violently, and the entire structure began to stir. Then, the mist lunged for him. The mist moved like a living thing, a coiling, twisting mass of dark vapor that surged toward Elias with terrifying speed. Shit! He threw himself backward, barely avoiding the tendrils of swirling black fog as they struck the cavern floor where he had been standing a second ago. The impact sizzled, the rock beneath melting into a bubbling sludge. Whatever this mist was, it wasn't just corrosive. It was alive, and it was hunting him. Elias, do you copy? Naomi's voice was sharp with urgency over the comms. We just detected a massive bioelectric surge down there. What the hell is happening? Elias scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. The mist, it's reacting to me. And there's something inside this structure. It's not just an old formation, Naomi, it's... The cavern shook violently. A deep, reverberating pulse echoed through the underground chamber. It wasn't just sound, it was something deeper, a tremor that rattled through Elias's bones like a warning. Then he saw it. The massive, organic structure at the cavern's center was moving. The bioluminescent veins running along its surface flared brighter, pulsing in rhythm, like the beating of a heart. And the mist wasn't random. It was part of it. Elias, listen to me. Naomi's voice was tight with alarm. The station's seismic readings just spiked again. This isn't a natural event. Something is waking up. Elias barely had time to process that before the mist lunged again. He pivoted, yanking his multi-tool from his belt, setting it to high-frequency output. A burst of ionized energy crackled from the device, dispersing the mist momentarily, just long enough for him to run. He sprinted across the cavern, boots slamming against the unstable ground. His only way out was the way he came, back up the fissure. But the mist was fast. Too fast. It coiled behind him, tendrils stretching, reforming, closing the distance. Then the structure let out another pulse, and the entire cavern lurched sideways. Elias barely managed to grab onto a jagged outcrop of rock as the ground beneath him gave way. Huge chunks of stone broke free, falling into the dark abyss below. The cavern was collapsing. Naomi's voice was pure panic now. Elias, the whole sector is destabilizing. You need to get out, now. Elias pulled himself up, eyes locking onto the lifeline cable he'd used to descend. It was still anchored, his only chance. He sprinted toward it, ignoring the way the mist shrieked and writhed behind him. He leaped, grabbing onto the cable just as another tremor ripped through the cavern. The structure was breaking apart. And then, it moved again. Not just the mist. Not just the cavern. Something inside the ancient structure shifted. Elias caught a glimpse of something massive, something dark and coiled, stirring within the glowing bioluminescent veins. The mist wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a defense mechanism. Whatever was buried down here, whatever had been sleeping for eons, was beginning to wake up. His breath caught. What the hell have we just disturbed? No time to think. The cavern was coming down around him. With everything he had, Elias activated his harness and began the ascent. The climb up was brutal. The tremors hadn't stopped, the fissure walls cracked and crumbled, sending debris raining past him. Elias dodged, using every ounce of strength to pull himself up faster. Come on, come on. Almost there, Carter. Naomi shouted. Keep climbing, the whole ground is shifting. Elias could feel it. The structure below was no longer stable, it was breaking free from whatever had been holding it underground. And as he reached the top of the fissure, hauling himself over the edge, he made the mistake of looking back. For a brief moment, through the swirling mist and the glowing fractures in the cavern floor, he saw it. Something colossal. Something with limbs like petrified roots, coiled and half-buried in the earth. Its body was covered in the same bioluminescent veins, glowing with a slow, rhythmic pulse. A heartbeat. And just as the last of the cavern collapsed, just as the fissure sealed itself shut with a thunderous impact, he saw one last thing. An eye. Massive. Ancient. Opening for the first time in eons. Then the ground caved in completely, and the fissure vanished. Elias stumbled into the research station, gasping for breath. His suit was scorched, streaked with black residue from the mist. Naomi rushed to help him, pulling his helmet off. What the hell happened down there? She demanded. What did you see? Elias's mind raced. The mist. The living structure. The thing buried beneath the planet's surface. He swallowed hard. We weren't just studying an extreme environment, Naomi. He looked her dead in the eye. We were standing on top of something that was never meant to wake up. Silence filled the lab. Even Vraxin, for once, had nothing to say. Then, an alert flashed across the station's monitors. New seismic activity detected. Surface disturbance detected. Elias turned to the viewport. Far in the distance, the ground was still shifting. Whatever was down there, it wasn't going back to sleep. The station's emergency alarms blared, red lights flashing across the control panels. The ground hadn't stopped moving. The once stable research site was now perched on unstable terrain, the very planet shifting beneath them. Naomi's voice cut through the chaos. Seismic activity is increasing. Whatever you saw down there, Elias, it's still moving. Elias barely had time to recover. His body ached from the climb, his oxygen levels were critically low, and his suit was streaked with the black mist, a substance that was still reacting with the material, corroding it in real time. He peeled off the outer layers of his suit and turned toward the main terminal. What's the latest on the filtration system? Naomi glanced at him, frustration clear on her face. You just climbed out of a collapsing fissure, and you're already worrying about the filter? Elias shot her a sharp look. If we don't get that fixed, we won't be breathing long enough to worry about the thing under our feet. She exhaled, refocusing. Right. The enzyme coating you developed is holding, so far. But we still don't have enough material to fully reinforce the entire system. Vraxen, who had been silent for longer than usual, finally spoke. You are suggesting the same mineral you extracted can protect the station's filtration system and potentially resist the corrosive biological agent beneath the surface. Elias nodded. It's the only shot we've got. Vraxen narrowed his slitted eyes. Fascinating. If it works, you will have proven that human ingenuity can, in fact, override biological inevitability. Elias smirked. That's the goal. They didn't have hours to run refined experiments. The fissure might be closed, but the seismic instability meant SciFi 7 wasn't done shifting. Naomi and Elias worked fast, refining the enzyme coating and scaling up production using what little functional equipment they had left. Every passing minute counted, oxygen levels continued to drop, and the station's primary filtration unit was one failure away from collapse. Elias ran a final stress test on the treated filter membrane. The first few readings looked good, but it wasn't enough. Come on, hold. A sudden spike in the system's pressure sent a warning alert across the monitors. The filtration unit stalled, threatening to cut off oxygen completely. Naomi's fingers flew over the controls. The pressure's too high. It's rejecting the treated membrane. Vraxen observed the chaos with a cool expression. It would seem your experiment is flawed after all. Elias gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to let this fail. The problem wasn't the membrane itself, it was the way it was being integrated into the system. The planet's natural conditions were too unpredictable to use a standard filtration method. Then it hit him. What if we let the station's own systems adapt instead of forcing the old method? Naomi turned to him. What do you mean? Elias grabbed a control panel and began recalibrating the filtration intake. Instead of using the old rigid system, we cycle the new filter dynamically, let the system breathe with the planet instead of trying to brute force a solution. Naomi hesitated for only a second, then nodded. Worth a shot. She helped him manually override the system, adjusting it to fluctuate with the atmospheric changes. The filters engaged. Everyone held their breath. For a tense few seconds, the numbers wavered, then stabilized. Oxygen levels held steady. The system adapted, running smoother than ever before. Elias exhaled, grinning despite his exhaustion. Told you. Vraxen blinked at the readings, his expression unreadable. Then, with the smallest tilt of his head, he muttered, impressive. The crisis seemed contained, but Elias knew better. The ground was still moving. The station sensors were still picking up seismic activity. Elias turned toward the viewport, staring at the shifting landscape beyond the acid rain. The fissure may have closed, but something beneath the surface had stirred. He clenched his fists. This planet isn't just dangerous. It's alive, and it's waking up. Naomi exhaled, still processing. So what do we do now? Elias glanced at Vraxen, whose arrogance had been replaced by genuine intrigue. We study it, Vraxen said simply. This planet is not what we thought it was. It is a living ecosystem on a scale we have never encountered. And now that we have disrupted it, we must determine whether it sees us as a threat. Elias didn't like the sound of that. Naomi shook her head. And if it does? The answer hung in the air, unspoken. If SciFi 7 was waking up, then humanity had just made its presence known. And some things in the universe should never be disturbed.